Imagine a 15-year-old teenager torn from his own home in the middle of the night. His parents are forcibly separated from him. Babylonian soldiers, the most feared in the ancient world, march him across 1,500 kilometers of desert for 4 months under a sun that cracks the earth. When he finally reaches his destination, he does not find a prison. He finds something much worse. He finds a palace. Because Nebuchadnezzar's plan for Daniel was not to kill him, it was to erase him, to erase his identity, his faith, his language, his name, everything that made him who he was, and transform him into a perfect Babylonian. And here is what no one tells you. This mental reprogramming program was so sophisticated that it would make any modern brainwashing look amateur. So how did a young Jewish man, alone, without a family, surrounded by the most powerful and seductive civilization in history, manage not only to survive, but to become the most influential man in the entire empire? The answer lies in the details of his daily life within those walls, and those details will surprise you. To understand what Daniel faced, you must first understand where he came from and where he was taken. Daniel was born in Jerusalem around 620 BC. He was of royal lineage, not just any peasant, but a young man of the Jewish nobility, likely educated from childhood in the study of the Torah, the Psalms, and the traditions of the patriarchs. His city, Jerusalem, was small. We are talking about an urban area that fit within 60 hectares, with perhaps 25,000 inhabitants in its best days. The streets were narrow, made of irregular stone, with limestone houses piled on top of each other on the hillsides. Solomon's temple dominated the landscape. It was the tallest, most important structure, the spiritual heart of everything. Daniel grew up hearing the songs of the Levites echoing from the Temple Mount. He grew up with the smell of incense and burnt offerings that rose like a permanent cloud over the city. This was his world. Now erase all of that. In 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, still the crown prince, not yet king, defeated Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish and descended upon Judah like a storm. Daniel chapter 1 verse 1 marks the moment. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim king Judah, Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. This first assault was not total destruction. That would come 19 years later. It was something more calculated. Nebuchadnezzar did not want to raze Jerusalem at that moment. He wanted its best resources. And the most valuable resource of any nation is not gold, it is brains. The biblical text is surgical in describing what Nebuchadnezzar ordered. Daniel 1:3-4 says, "The king commanded Ashpenaz, the chief of his eunuchs, to select young men from the royal family and the nobility, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace." Notice the criteria. It wasn't just any prisoner. Nebuchadnezzar wanted the intellectual elite of Jerusalem, the best-looking, the smartest, the most cultured, and he wanted them young because the young are moldable. Daniel was one of those selected. Along with him, 3 other names you probably know: Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. 4 teenagers from the Jewish nobility, torn from their families, placed in a caravan, and marched across the Fertile Crescent to the heart of the Babylonian Empire. The journey from Jerusalem to Babylon was not a straight line through the desert. No one would survive that. The route followed the arc of the Euphrates River, going north through Syria and then down into Mesopotamia. It was approximately 1,500 kilometers of walking, 4 months on the road. 4 months for a teenager to process that he would never see his parents again, that everything he knew was left behind, that every step took him further from home. The heat of the Syrian desert during the day easily exceeded 45 degrees Celsius. Nights dropped below 10 degrees. Dust got into their eyes, mouths, and lungs. Their feet bled in their sandals after the first week, and every day, every week, the landscape became stranger, flatter, vaster, more alien to eyes that only knew the green hills of Judah. And then, after 4 months, Daniel saw Babylon for the first time. Try to imagine what this boy felt. He came from Jerusalem, a city that fit in 60 hectares. Babylon had more than 900 hectares within its walls. The first thing he saw, probably from miles away, was the Etemenanke Ziggurat, the biblical Tower of Babel, a 91-meter-high structure, equivalent to a 30-story building, rising in steps toward the sky. Around it, the city's double walls stretched for an 18-kilometer perimeter. The outer walls were 7 meters thick, the inner ones 6 meters. Between them, a 12-meter space filled with compacted earth, so wide that chariots could pass side by side on top. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Babylon decades later, wrote that the city surpassed in splendor any city of the known world. And Daniel entered through one of the 8 monumental gates. The most famous was the Ishtar Gate. And here, archaeology confirms everything. This gate was excavated by Robert Koldewey in 1902 and is today reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. It is 14 meters high. It is entirely covered in brilliant cobalt blue glazed bricks, a blue so intense it seems impossible for antiquity. And against this blue background, 575 figures of animals in relief, golden bulls and dragons, arranged in symmetrical rows, each over 2 meters long. Imagine walking through this corridor with these golden creatures watching you from both sides, the blue shining under the Mesopotamian sun. For a Jewish boy from Jerusalem, it must have seemed like the entrance to another world, and it was only the beginning. After the gate, the processional way stretched for almost a kilometer, an avenue 20 meters wide, paved with slabs of white and pink limestone, flanked by 12-meter walls covered with lions glazed in blue and ochre. 60 lions on each side. 120 immense predators in relief with open jaws, accompanying every step of those entering the city. The floor was so polished, it reflected the light. The effect was deliberate. Nebuchadnezzar wanted any visitor, any ambassador, any prisoner to feel in their bones that they were entering the center of the universe. And the sound. Babylon was a city of 200,000 inhabitants. Some estimates reached 300,000 in its peak days. Imagine the noise. Merchants shouting in Aramaic, Akkadian, Elamite, Egyptian, carts creaking over the stone, the lowing of oxen being led to slaughter, the clang of hammers in bronze workshops, musicians playing lyres and drums on street corners. The Euphrates River cut the city in half. Its reed boats and barges loaded with wheat created constant traffic. And above all this, the smell. The smell of an ancient metropolis without modern sewage treatment, mixed with incense burning in the temples, meat roasting in the markets, beer fermenting in the taverns. Because yes, the Babylonians were master brewers, producing more than 20 different types of beer. If you think Daniel stayed in a cell or in some prisoner quarters, you are completely mistaken. This is the most disturbing part of the whole story. Daniel was taken to the royal palace. Nebuchadnezzar's southern palace, excavated by archaeology, was a monstrous complex of 52,000 square meters, 5 interconnected courtyards, hundreds of rooms, 7-meter-thick walls, all decorated with glazed bricks in geometric and floral patterns. The throne room alone was 52 meters long by 17 meters wide, larger than many modern churches. The walls were covered with reliefs of lions, palm trees, and lotus flowers in blue, yellow, and white against a dark blue background. Daniel slept there, he ate there, he studied there. He was not a slave, he was an investment. Nebuchadnezzar was spending the empire's resources to transform these boys into useful instruments. And the first stage of the program was the most aggressive. The biblical text describes the re-education program in details that, when you stop to analyze them, are frightening in their psychological precision. First, the language. Daniel 1:4 says, "They were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans." This meant learning cuneiform, the Babylonian writing system that used more than 600 different signs pressed into clay tablets with a stylus. For comparison, the Hebrew alphabet Daniel knew had 22 letters. He was forced to master a system 30 times more complex. And it wasn't just writing. It was an entire literary tradition. Babylonian mathematics with a base 60 sexagesimal system, advanced astronomy with eclipse records going back centuries, epic literature like the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh, texts on astrology, omens, and religious rituals. It was the ancient equivalent of putting a foreign student into an intensive PhD program, in a language he didn't speak, on subjects that contradicted everything he believed. Second, the names. This is brutal. Daniel, which in Hebrew means "God is my judge," was renamed Belteshazzar, which means "May Bel protect his life." Bel was another name for Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon. Hananiah, "The Lord is gracious," became Shadrach. Mishael, who is like God, became Meshach. Azariah, "The Lord helps," became Abednego. Notice what happened. Each Hebrew name contained a theological statement about the God of Israel. Each Babylonian name replaced that statement with a reference to pagan gods. A name is identity. Changing the name is changing who you are inside. Every time someone called Daniel Belteshazzar, they were reinforcing that he now belonged to Marduk, not Yahweh. It was a conditioning technique, repeated thousands of times a day for years until the old name felt like a distant memory. If this impressed you, leave a like now so this video can reach more people who need to know this story. Third, and here enters the detail that changed everything, the food. Daniel 1:5 says the king assigned them a daily portion of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank. This sounds like a privilege, right? Food from the royal table. The best cuts of meat, the finest wines, the rarest fruits. Any other prisoner of war would kill for this treatment. But Daniel refused. And here is where most people do not understand the true dimension of what was happening. The food was not just food. In Babylon, every royal meal was first offered to the gods. The meat was consecrated to Marduk, to Ishtar, to Nabu. The wine was poured out as a libation before idols before reaching the table. To eat that food was not simply to violate Jewish dietary laws from Leviticus. It was to participate in an act of pagan worship. Every bite was a declaration of spiritual loyalty. Nebuchadnezzar could change Daniel's name. He could change his language. He could change his clothes. But the food was the final line, the last battlefield for that boy's soul. And what Daniel did was extraordinary. Not for the courage, which is obvious, but for the intelligence. He did not protest. He did not make a scene. He did not quote the Torah to the chief of the eunuchs. The text says that he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself, an internal, silent decision. And then he went to Ashpenaz and requested with respect an alternative. Daniel said, "Please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink." Vegetables and water, 10 days. He transformed a religious confrontation into a scientific proposal, a test with a control group, defined variables, and an evaluation period. This teenager, alone in the heart of the world's most powerful empire, without any adult to protect him, negotiated his spiritual survival with the diplomatic skill of a veteran ambassador. The result? Daniel says that after 10 days, his face and those of his companions appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. The Hebrew word used here is barium, which literally means full, healthy, glowing. The 4 Jews eating vegetables and water looked healthier than everyone else eating the royal banquet. Ashpenaz saw the result, and from Gunal on, he took away the king's portion and kept Daniel's diet. But Daniel's life in Babylon was not just a silent spiritual battle. It was a total immersion in a civilization that operated on a scale Jerusalem could never imagine. And to understand his daily life inside the palace, you must understand how Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon functioned, because every detail of this city was designed to do one thing: convince anyone that the Babylonian gods were the true owners of the universe. Daniel's routine began before dawn. The student of the royal program woke up to the sound of ritual trumpets that marked the first prayer of the day in the temples. The palace complex was connected to the Esagila, the main temple of Marduk, by corridors and internal passages. The smell of incense was constant. It wasn't a pleasant temple aroma. It was a dense, heavy cloud made of resins imported from Arabia. Myrrh, frankincense, and cypress burned in bronze furnaces 24 hours a day. This smell permeated clothes, hair, and skin. Daniel smelled like Babylon, whether he wanted to or not. Classes took place in rooms within the palace complex, probably in the Bit Mummy sector, the House of Knowledge, where royal scribes were trained. Archaeological excavations in Babylon found thousands of educational cuneiform tablets, copying exercises, vocabulary lists, mathematical problems, star catalogues. Daniel sat on the floor on reed mats, with a fresh clay tablet in his lap and a cane stylus in his hand, and copied cuneiform texts for hours. The clay had to be at the right humidity, too wet, and the stylus sank, too dry, and it cracked. His fingers were covered in clay. His eyes burned for concentrating on those tiny signs. And the content of those tablets was the opposite of everything Daniel had learned in Jerusalem, where the Torah said, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." The Babylonian Enuma Elish taught that the world was formed from the mangled body of Tiamat, the goddess of chaos, cut in half by Marduk. Where the Psalms declared the heavens declare the glory of God, Babylonian astronomical texts taught that the planets were visible manifestations of the gods. Jupiter was Marduk, Venus was Ishtar, Saturn was Ninurta. Every star, every eclipse, every comet was an omen sent by pagan gods. Daniel was being trained to read the sky as a message from idols, the same sky he had learned to see as the work of the one God of Israel. And here is something few realize. Daniel did not reject this knowledge. He absorbed it all. Daniel said that God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. He didn't close his eyes and plug his ears. He learned mathematics, astronomy, literature, the legal system, imperial administration. He learned it all, and he learned it better than everyone else. The text is devastating. In all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. 10 times, not a little better, 10 times superior to all the professional sages of the empire. If you believe that God's wisdom surpasses any human knowledge, comment, "God is greater." This reveals something profound about Daniel's strategy. He didn't survive in Babylon by resisting everything. He survived by distinguishing what he could accept from what he could not. The language? He accepted. Learning Chaldean did not compromise his faith. The name? He tolerated. He knew who he was inside, no matter what they shouted on the outside. The education? He mastered. Knowledge is a tool, not idolatry. The food? He refused, because there lay the boundary between learning about Babylonian gods and worshipping them. This distinction between adaptation and assimilation was what kept Daniel whole for decades in a culture designed to devour him. But the palace was not just a study center. It was the nervous heart of an empire that stretched from Egypt to Persia. and the daily routine within those walls was a constant demonstration of power that tested the limits of any foreigner's sanity. Meals in the palace were spectacles. We are not talking about a simple table. Excavations at the southern palace revealed industrial kitchens with clay ovens capable of roasting dozens of animals simultaneously. Royal banquets served gazelle, mutton, duck, goose, fish from the Euphrates, barley and fine wheat bread, fresh and dried dates, pomegranates, figs, grapes, goat cheese, beer of at least 8 different varieties, and wine imported from vineyards in Syria and Anatolia. Administrative tablets found by archaeologists list daily rations distributed to hundreds of courtiers, officials, and, pay attention, foreign royal prisoners. One of these tablets, dated to Nebuchadnezzar's reign, mentions oil and barley rations delivered to Joachim, king of the land of Ehud, Jehoiakim, king of Judah, the same king who was deported before Daniel. Archaeology confirms that defeated kings were kept in the Babylonian palace, fed by the king's table. Daniel saw these banquets every day. He saw the other young men in the program eating, drinking, and laughing. And he sat with his vegetables and his water. But here is the detail no one tells you about life inside the palace, and it makes Daniel's situation infinitely more complicated than it seems. The chief responsible for Daniel is called in the text the chief of the eunuchs. The Hebrew word is Sar-Hasarisim, and many scholars believe this is not just the supervisor's title. It is an indication of what might have been done to the young men in the program themselves. Isaiah 39:7 contains a direct prophecy about the royal descendants of Judah taken to Babylon, and they shall take away some of your sons, who will descend from you, whom you will beget, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Eunuchs. The castration of captured young nobles was standard practice in the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, documented in dozens of cuneiform texts. The goal was twofold: to ensure these young men never generated descendants who could claim thrones, and to make them completely dependent on the king, with no family, no future of their own, and no loyalty possible to anything other than the palace. Daniel may have been subjected to this. The biblical text never mentions a wife or children for Daniel in any of his 80 or more years of recorded life. No descendants, no romance, nothing. The silence is deafening. And if this is true, it means Nebuchadnezzar was not just trying to change what Daniel thought. He was trying to destroy who Daniel could become. He took away his family. He took away his name. He took away his language. He took away his food. And he may have taken away the possibility of Daniel ever having a family of his own. And even so, even after all that, Daniel did not break. Not only did he not break, but he rose within that palace until he became the second most powerful person in Babylon. And what happened next during Nebuchadnezzar's reign is where this story transforms from impressive to absolutely impossible. 2 years after Daniel's arrival in Babylon, something happened that changed the course of history and almost cost the lives of all the empire's sages. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. This might seem trivial to our modern mindset, but in ancient Babylon, royal dreams were matters of state, literally. The Babylonians maintained entire libraries dedicated to the interpretation of dreams, massive collections of cuneiform tablets cataloging thousands of dream images and their meanings. If the king dreamed of a lion, it meant one thing. If he dreamed of murky water, it meant another. If he dreamed of teeth falling out, it meant war. There were manuals, protocols, professional specialists whose only function in life was to decode what the king saw when he slept. And Nebuchadnezzar had dozens of these specialists at his disposal: magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and Chaldeans, as the biblical text lists. An entire bureaucratic machine dedicated to keeping the king's sleep interpreted and his fears soothed. But this time, Nebuchadnezzar did something no one expected. He called all his sages to the throne room, that 52-meter-long hall I described before, and said, "I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream." Up to here, routine. But then came the impossible demand. Daniel 2:5. The king said, "If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap." The sages replied, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation." And Nebuchadnezzar said, "No, you will tell me what the dream was, and then you will interpret it. If you cannot, I will know that you are frauds, and you all die." Think about this. He didn't just ask for the interpretation. Any charlatan could invent one. He asked them to guess the dream itself, a verification impossible to fake. If they got the dream right, he would know the interpretation was also reliable. It was a perfect logical trap, and the sages panicked. The Chaldeans' response is revealing. Daniel 2:10-11, "There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. No king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean." They were right, technically. No human system of divination can do that. There is no cuneiform tablet that teaches how to read another person's mind. But Nebuchadnezzar didn't care about technical limitations. He was the most powerful man on the planet, and his word was law, literally. The decree went out. All the sages of Babylon were to be executed. All of them. And here is where the situation hits Daniel directly. Because Daniel, as a graduate of the Royal Education Program, was classified as one of the sages. He was on the execution list. Arioch, the captain of the Royal Guard, was already going from door to door with soldiers to begin the slaughter when he knocked on Daniel's door. The detail the text records is impressive in its calmness. Daniel did not panic. He did not try to flee. Where would he flee to? He was in the center of an empire with no safe border for thousands of kilometers. Instead, he asked Arioch, with what the text describes as counsel and wisdom, why the decree was so urgent. And when he learned of the dream, he did something that required almost insane audacity. He requested an audience with Nebuchadnezzar to solve the problem. Notice the magnitude of what is happening. A young Jew, a foreigner, a deportee, possibly mutilated with only a few years of training, is offering to do what the entire intellectual elite of Babylon declared impossible. If he failed, he would not just be executed, he would be torn apart. The text is explicit about the method, dismemberment. Surviving Assyrian reliefs show exactly how this was done. Prisoners tied down, while soldiers cut off limbs one by one with bronze knives. Nebuchadnezzar inherited these practices. Daniel knew what was at stake. And yet he asked for time, and he received it. And what he did with that time reveals everything about who Daniel really was. He didn't open a book. He didn't consult cuneiform tablets. He didn't seek Babylonian divination techniques. He went home, gathered Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his 3 friends from Jerusalem, and prayed. 4 Jewish teenagers kneeling on the floor of a room in the palace of Babylon, asking the God of Israel to reveal the secret of the most powerful king on earth. That is the image. 4 boys against an entire empire. And that night, Daniel had a vision. What Daniel saw and what he described to Nebuchadnezzar the next day is one of the most extraordinary passages in the entire Bible. He entered the throne room, those blue glazed brick walls, those golden lions shining in the torchlight. Nebuchadnezzar sitting on the elevated throne, likely surrounded by guards, advisors, the same sages who had failed and now awaited their own deaths. And Daniel began to speak. "You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome." The dream was about a colossal statue, but not just any statue. Each part was made of a different material. The head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet, and here is the crucial detail, were of iron mixed with clay, a fragile foundation supporting a magnificent structure. And then, while the king watched, a stone was cut out without human hands, struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay, and the entire structure collapsed. The gold, the silver, the bronze, the iron, all became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away. And the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Imagine the silence in the throne room when Daniel described these images. Nebuchadnezzar knew it was exactly what he had dreamed. Every detail, every metal, every image. This young Jew had just done what the entire intellectual apparatus of the empire declared impossible. But the dream was only half. The interpretation was the part that changed everything. Daniel looked at Nebuchadnezzar, the man who had destroyed Jerusalem, burned the temple, dragged his people into exile, and said, "You are this head of gold." The king was the gold, the most precious material, the top of the statue. Nebuchadnezzar must have liked that part, but Daniel did not stop there. "But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours, the silver, less valuable than gold. Then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, which breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And that kingdom will be divided, iron mixed with clay, strong and fragile at the same time." Scholars then and now debate the details, but the general structure is crystal clear. Babylon would fall, and the kingdom that replaced it would also fall, and the next, and the next. Every human empire, no matter how glorious, is temporary, until the feet of clay arrive and everything crumbles. Think about what Daniel just said to the most powerful man in the world. He said, "Your empire will end, others will come, and they will also end." Every one of these words could be interpreted as treason. In any other context, telling the king his kingdom would be succeeded by others could mean instant death. But Daniel had a shield that no other sage possessed. He had gotten the dream right. He had proven before the entire court that his source of information was real, and Nebuchadnezzar's reaction is one of the most surreal scenes in the Bible. Daniel 2:46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, prostrate before Daniel. The king of Babylon, the conqueror of the known world, prostrated himself before a deported Jewish teenager. And not only that, he commanded that they should present an offering and incense to Daniel. And he said, "Truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings." The man who had burned the temple of Yahweh just declared that Yahweh was superior to his own gods. The irony is almost unbearable, and what came next transformed Daniel from a promising student into one of the most powerful figures in the empire. Daniel 2:48. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon, governor of the province of Babylon, chief of all the sages. This boy who arrived chained in a caravan of deportees was now the second most important man in the largest city in the world. And notice, he didn't ask for the position. He didn't conspire. He didn't flatter. He did one thing that others could not do, and the system elevated him. But Daniel did something equally revealing at this moment of triumph. He requested that his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, be appointed administrators of the province. He did not forget who prayed with him that night, did not rise alone. And these 3 friends were going to need all the protection they could get, because what was about to happen would put their faith to the test in a way that makes the refusal of food look like child's play. Nebuchadnezzar, like any tyrant who receives a partially flattering revelation, heard only the part he wanted to hear. "You are the head of gold." Gold. He was gold. And with this idea hammering in his head, he made a decision that perfectly defines the psychology of absolute power. He ordered a statue to be built, entirely of gold. Daniel 3:1 specifies the dimensions: 60 cubits high, 6 cubits wide, translating to modern measurements, approximately 27 meters high by 2.7 meters wide. For reference, the Statue of Liberty without the pedestal is 46 meters. Nebuchadnezzar's statue was more than half that size, and this was 2,500 years ago without modern engineering, all plated in gold. It likely wasn't solid gold. The cost would be incalculable even for the richest empire on earth, but gold leaf over a wood or clay structure shining under the Mesopotamian sun like a second sun planted in the plain of Dura on the outskirts of Babylon. The message was clear and direct. Daniel said the head was gold and the rest were inferior materials. Nebuchadnezzar replied, "My empire is gold from top to bottom, from beginning to end, forever." He took Daniel's prophecy and rewrote it in molten metal. No inferior kingdom would succeed his. Only gold, only Babylon, eternally. And then came the order. Every official of the empire, satraps, administrators, governors, councillors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces had to attend the dedication of the statue. And when the royal orchestra played, the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, everyone had to fall down and worship the gold statue. No exceptions. And whoever did not fall down and worship would be cast immediately into the midst of a burning fiery furnace, not imprisoned, not judged, burned alive. Babylon had massive industrial furnaces used for making bricks, clay structures that reached temperatures above 1,000 degrees. Nebuchadnezzar turned industrial equipment into an instrument of execution. And now, think of the position of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel is not mentioned in this scene. Perhaps he was on a diplomatic mission. Perhaps he was in another part of the empire. The text does not explain. But his 3 friends were there, on the plain of Dura, before that blinding golden statue, surrounded by thousands of officials from the entire empire. And when the music began to play, that cacophony of instruments echoing across the flat plain, everyone prostrated themselves. Thousands of people falling to the ground simultaneously, like a field of wheat under the wind. Everyone except 3. 3 men remained standing. In the middle of an open plain, surrounded by thousands of prostrate people, 3 vertical figures were as visible as beacons in the darkness. There was no way to hide. There was no ambiguity. The whole field could see that 3 Jewish officials, administrators appointed by Daniel himself, refused to worship the king's statue. And the Chaldeans who denounced them did so with pleasure. Daniel 3:8 uses an expression that in Aramaic literally means they ate the pieces of. They destroyed them through gossip. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. Political envy disguised as religious loyalty. The native Babylonian officials hated that foreigners occupied positions of power, and now they had the perfect weapon to destroy them. Nebuchadnezzar was furious, but, and this shows he had some respect for these men, he gave them a second chance. He called the 3 before him and said, "I will have the music play again. If you fall down, all is forgiven. If not, the furnace." And then he added a phrase that sealed the confrontation. "And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" The response of the 3 Jews is one of the most brutal declarations of faith ever recorded. Daniel 3:16-18. O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. Read the central part again. But if not, they said, our God can save us. But if he decides not to save, we will burn to death anyway, and we still will not worship your statue. This is not blind faith. This is faith that looks at death and does not blink. They had no guarantee of rescue. They had no specific promise that they would be saved. They had a conviction, and they were willing to die for it. Nebuchadnezzar ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual. The number 7 in Babylonian context represented totality, the maximum possible. The soldiers who threw the 3 men into the furnace died from the heat just by approaching the entrance. The fire killed even before touching, and then something happened that made Nebuchadnezzar leap from his throne. Daniel 3:24-25. The king was astonished and said to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire?" They answered, "True, O king." And he said, "I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. 4, not 3, loose, not bound, walking, not writhing." Inside a furnace that killed soldiers at the entrance, 3 Jews were strolling without a singed hair, and there was someone else there with them. When they came out, because Nebuchadnezzar shouted for them to come out, calling them servants of the Most High God, the text records a forensic detail. The satraps, administrators, governors, and counselors gathered around them and saw that the fire had no power over their bodies. Not a hair of their heads was singed. Their clothes were intact. And, this detail is extraordinary, not even the smell of smoke was on them. In a city where the smell of incense permeated everything, where Daniel could not escape the aroma of Babylon, 3 men came out of an industrial furnace without the smell of fire. Babylon could not mark them, not with names, not with food, not with fire. Nebuchadnezzar issued a new decree, this time forbidding anyone in the entire empire from speaking against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he promoted the 3 to even higher positions. The pattern repeated itself. Babylon tried to crush, failed, and the Jews rose higher. But what was happening inside Nebuchadnezzar's head was something that would take years to complete, and the next chapter of Daniel's life involves the strangest and most humiliating moment in the life of the most powerful king of antiquity, a transformation so bizarre that historians and theologians debate to this day whether it should be read as a miracle, as a clinical illness, or as both at the same time. Daniel chapter 4 is a unique document in the entire Bible because it is not narrated by Daniel. It is narrated by Nebuchadnezzar himself. A royal edict, written in the first person, addressed to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. The king of Babylon writing an open letter to all humanity, confessing what happened to him. And what happened begins with another dream. This time, Nebuchadnezzar saw a tree, a colossal tree, visible to the ends of the earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit. Animals rested in its shade, birds nested in its branches, every living creature fed from it. And then a watcher, an angel, descended from heaven and cried, "Chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Nevertheless, leave the stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, in the tender grass of the field." And the sentence, "Let his heart be changed from that of a man, let him be given the heart of a beast, and let 7 times pass over him." Nebuchadnezzar called the sages, again, and again none could interpret it, or perhaps they didn't want to, because the interpretation was too obvious, and no one wanted to be the messenger of bad news to a man who threw people into furnaces. So they called Daniel, and the text records something that reveals the complexity of the relationship between these 2 men. When Daniel understood the dream, he was astonished for a whole hour, not out of fear, out of grief. Daniel 4:19. "My Lord, May the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies." Daniel did not want to give that news. This is a detail easily lost. Daniel had plenty of reasons to hate Nebuchadnezzar. This was the man who destroyed Jerusalem, who burned the temple, who killed entire Jewish families, who tore Daniel from his land when he was little more than a child. But there, before the throne, Daniel felt pity for the king, and he told the truth anyway. The tree was Nebuchadnezzar. His greatness had grown to reach the sky. Literally, his building projects tried to rival the gods. And the sentence was that he would be driven from men, dwell with the beasts of the field, eat grass like oxen, and be wet with the dew of heaven for 7 times, 7 years, until he recognized that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. Daniel did something no other Babylonian advisor would dare. He gave unsolicited advice to the king. Daniel 4:27. "Therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor." A deported Jew asking the world's greatest conqueror to be merciful to the poor. The audacity is almost comical and completely sincere. Nebuchadnezzar did not listen. 12 months later, text is precise in its chronology. The king was walking on the roof of the royal palace. That palace he built brick by brick, with inscriptions on each one bearing his name. And he said, "Is not this great Babylon, that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power, and for the honor of my majesty?" The words were still in the king's mouth when a voice fell from heaven. "King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you." That very hour the sentence was fulfilled. Nebuchadnezzar was driven from men. He ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, until his hair grew like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. Modern medicine has a name for this: clinical lycanthropy, or bonethropy more specifically. A rare and documented psychiatric condition where the patient believes they are an animal and begins to behave as such. There are cases recorded in medical literature from the 19th and 20th centuries. The most powerful king in the world, builder of wonders that rivaled the pyramids, lived as an animal for 7 years. And Daniel? During those 7 years, someone kept the empire running. Someone administered the provinces, collected tributes, maintained the armies. The text does not say explicitly, but Daniel was the governor of the province of Babylon and chief of all the sages. The infrastructure of power passed through him. It is very likely that Daniel was one of the pillars that prevented the empire from collapsing during the king's madness, the deported Jew holding the reins of the empire that deported him. When Nebuchadnezzar came to his senses, and he did, the royal edict he wrote ends with words no Mesopotamian monarch had ever written before. "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth and his ways justice. And those who walk in pride he is able to put down." The man who thought he were God recognized he was grass. Nebuchadnezzar died around 562 BC after a 43-year reign. What followed was what happens to almost every empire built around a singular personality: accelerated disintegration. In 7 years, 4 kings succeeded one another on the throne of Babylon. Assassinations, conspiracies, palace coups. The empire that seemed eternal was tearing itself apart from within. And in 539 BC, just 23 years after Nebuchadnezzar's death, the last king of Babylon threw a party. His name was Belshazzar. Technically, he was co-regent. His father Nabonidus was absent, possibly on campaign in the Arabian desert. But that night, Belshazzar was the man on the throne, and he made a banquet for 1,000 of his lords, 1,000 people eating and drinking in the palace Nebuchadnezzar built. And then Belshazzar made the mistake that would seal the empire's fate. Daniel 5:2. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, the sacred vessels of Solomon's temple, those same vessels that had been used in the service of the God of Israel for centuries. Belshazzar ordered them filled with wine, and he, his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. And as they drank, they praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. It was the ultimate profanation, and it was deliberate. Belshazzar did not do this out of ignorance. He knew exactly where those vessels came from. He knew what they represented, and he chose to defy them as a demonstration of power. It was the last demonstration of power for Babylon. In that same hour, the text uses the same expression of urgency. The fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the palace wall, opposite the lampstand, where everyone could see. Not a whole hand, just fingers. Writing alone on a white plaster wall by candlelight, while 1,000 people watched in frozen silence, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Daniel 5:6. Then the king's countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked against each other. Belshazzar trembled so much, his knees knocked. The man who 10 minutes earlier toasted with sacred vessels was now paralyzed with terror, and the words on the wall, no one could read them, or no one could interpret them, until the Queen Mother entered and said, "There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy God. In the days of your father he was made chief of the sages, called Daniel." And Daniel came. He was no longer a young man. Decades had passed since the dream of the statue. Daniel was an elderly man, likely in his 80s. He had served under Nebuchadnezzar for his entire reign. He had survived the 4 kings who followed the death of the great conqueror. And now he stood before another Babylonian king in another impossible crisis. Belshazzar offered gifts, purple, a gold chain, the 3rd place in the kingdom. Daniel refused the gifts, or rather, he said to give them to another, and then he did what he always did. He told the unfiltered truth. He reminded Belshazzar of Nebuchadnezzar's story, the greatness, the madness, the humiliation, the restoration. And he said, "But you, son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart. Although you knew all this, and you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven, they have brought the vessels of his house before you." And then he read the words on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, counted, weighed, divided. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That very night, Belshazzar was slain. The Persian army of Cyrus the Great entered the city by diverting the course of the Euphrates River, passing under the walls through the dry riverbed, while the city feasted. Invincible Babylon, those double walls where chariots could pass side by side, that water-filled moat, those bronze gates, fell in a single night almost without a fight. The Feast of the Sacred Vessels was the last feast of Babylon. Daniel had arrived in the city as a prisoner of an empire that seemed eternal, and now he saw that empire fall while he was still alive. The gold head of the statue had just shattered, exactly as he had prophesied decades earlier, before a young Nebuchadnezzar who did not believe his gold could turn to dust. But Daniel's story does not end with the fall of Babylon. It gains one final chapter, perhaps the most famous of all. Because Darius the Mede, who took over the government of ancient Babylon under Cyrus's authority, recognized in Daniel the same competence Nebuchadnezzar had seen decades before. Daniel 6:3. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. Again, a new empire, a new king, and Daniel rising to the top once more. a man over 80 years old, serving his third political regime, so indispensable that the Persians, who had just conquered everything, wanted to put him in charge. And again, as happens to any foreigner who rises too fast, envy came. The Persian satraps and governors tried to find something against Daniel, any irregularity, any administrative error, any sign of corruption. Daniel 6:4. They could find no charge or fault because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. None. Decades of public service in two different empires and no irregularity. So they did what is always done when competence cannot be attacked. They attacked his faith. They convinced Darius to sign a decree. Anyone who made a petition to any god or man except the king for 30 days would be cast into the den of lions. And the law of the Medes and Persians, unlike the Babylonian law, could not be revoked even by the king who signed it. When Daniel knew the decree was signed, he went home. He opened the windows of his room that faced Jerusalem, the city he had not seen in over 60 years, knelt and prayed 3 times a day, as he had always done, every day. Since he was a teenager, the same prayer, the same direction, the same faith. He knew of the decree. He knew the windows were visible. He knew they were watching. And he prayed anyway, not out of defiance, not for show. Because Daniel, over 80 years old, having survived empires, furnaces, mad kings, and conspiracies, was not going to change now. The conspirators ran to Darius. And Darius, who genuinely liked Daniel, was devastated. He spent the entire day trying to find a legal loophole to save his best administrator. He found none. The law he himself signed bound him. At sunset, Daniel was cast into the lion's den, and Darius said something no Persian king should say: "Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you." A pagan king expressing faith in the God of Israel because the testimony of an entire life was more powerful than any decree. Darius did not sleep that night. He refused food. He refused entertainment. At dawn, the text says he rose very early. He ran to the lion's den and cried out with a lamenting voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" And from the bottom of the den, the voice of an 80-year-old man, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me." Daniel spent the entire night with lions that were kept hungry on purpose for this type of execution, and he woke up without a scratch. When the conspirators were thrown into the same den, they, their wives, and their children, according to the brutal custom of the time, the lions overpowered them before they even reached the bottom. The same lions, the same den, completely different results. And here is the thing about Daniel's life in Babylon that makes his story different from any other in the Bible. Most biblical heroes have an arc, a rise, a fall, a redemption. Moses killed a man and fled. David committed adultery and murder. Peter denied Christ 3 times. The Bible does not hide the flaws of its characters, but Daniel has no fall. From the first verse of chapter 1 to the last verse of chapter 12, he is consistent. Not because he was perfect in some superhuman sense, but because he decided at 13 or 14 years old who he was going to be. And he never renegotiated that decision. When the king's food tried to assimilate him, he refused. When the king's dream could have puffed him up with pride, he gave credit to God. When the gold statue demanded worship, his friends, trained by the same spirit, stood tall. When the Persian law said, "Do not pray," he opened the window. Each generation brought a new threat, and each time the answer was the same: no. And this is the part most people don't realize about Daniel's story. It is not the miracles that make it extraordinary. The miracles are the consequence. What is extraordinary is the repeated decision, daily, mundane, without an audience, to keep his identity intact within a system designed to erase it. Think about what Babylon represented, the most sophisticated assimilation system of the ancient world. An apparatus that changed your name, your diet, your language, your education, your career, everything. That surrounded you with luxury, with power, with rewards for conformity. That made resistance not only dangerous, but seemingly irrational. Why risk everything when Babylon is offering everything? Daniel did not live in a desert, resisting the temptation of simplicity. He lived in the center of power, surrounded by comfort, and resisted the temptation of convenience. That is infinitely harder. And now think about how this applies to anyone watching this video. You are likely not in Babylon. There is no king threatening to throw you into a furnace. No one is trying to change your name by force. But the system of assimilation continues to work. It has just changed its form. Today, the pressure does not come from an imperial decree. It comes from an algorithm, from a culture that says you need to look, think, consume, and believe in a certain way to be accepted. That offers rewards for conformity and social punishment for resistance. That changes your priorities so gradually that you don't notice until you look in the mirror and don't recognize who is standing there. Daniel in Babylon is not an ancient story about an ancient man in an ancient place. It is a survival manual for anyone who has ever asked, how do I keep who I am when everything around me is trying to turn me into something else? Daniel's answer, the answer he lived for over 60 years in exile, was not complicated. It did not involve elaborate strategies, nor political resistance plans, nor public demonstrations. The answer was an open window toward Jerusalem 3 times a day, every day, without exception, without negotiation. The answer was knowing exactly who you are before the system tries to tell you who you should be. It was a decision made before the pressure arrived, so that when it arrived, the answer was already ready. Daniel did not decide to resist in the hour of crisis. He had already decided decades before, when he was a boy looking at a plate of royal food and choosing vegetables. Every small decision was training for the next. The refusal of the food prepared for the refusal of the statue. The refusal of the statue prepared for the refusal to stop praying. A lifetime of small no's that made the big no possible when it really mattered. Daniel died in Babylon, or in Persia, technically. The empire had changed hands around him. He never returned to Jerusalem. He never saw the temple rebuilt. He spent his entire life in exile, serving foreign empires with excellence, maintaining his faith without a temple, without priests, without sacrifices, without any of the religious apparatus that sustained his people's faith. And yet Daniel records, so this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. He prospered. He did not just survive, he prospered. A boy torn from home at 13 who saw everything he loved destroyed, who was molded by the most powerful empire on earth, and who somehow came out the other side whole, with the same God, with the same faith, with the same window open toward Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon is in ruins today. Those walls that impressed the world are mounds of sand in the Iraqi desert. The Ishtar Gate, the original, is in a museum in Berlin, behind glass. The Hanging Gardens, if they existed, disappeared without a trace. The empire that seemed eternal lasted less than a century after Nebuchadnezzar, but the book that a Jewish teenager began to live in that city, that book is still being read. It is still being studied. It is still changing lives. 3,000 years later, Babylon is dust, and Daniel is still standing. If you made it this far, click on the next video appearing on your screen. I prepared it especially for those who watched this one to the end.